Hello, my name is Katie O'Dare, and I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Student Life at Boston College. Welcome to Veritas at Vinum. Veritas at Vinum is a conversation series that features prominent faculty and administrators sharing their stories, how they began their careers in higher education, the people and events that had an impact on their professional development, and what it means to them personally to work at a Jesuit and Catholic university. Archived conversations can be viewed at the Church in the 21st Century Center website. Thank you, and enjoy the conversations.
It's very nice to be here, and I'm supposed to say something about how I actually am here. So I'm going to say something for about 20 minutes so that I can get comments and questions. And I'm very mindful that the majority of you are graduate students, so I want to get to graduate school and then leave it and get to teaching at BC. So. The first is that I come from Brooklyn. I was raised from a working class background. There were 5 children in my family, and my dad was a police officer and had 1 or 2 other jobs to keep him going. And my mother, besides being a homemaker, also did secretarial work just to keep us from being poor. And eventually we moved to Long Island, where I went to high school. And that was a very big shift in life, to go from a strong neighborhood, Brooklyn. Everybody on my block's name was Norton, Kelly, Kilbane, Birmingham. Everybody was Irish Catholic. Diversity was if somebody had an Italian in-law. And we all came from parishes. So we came from a fairly homogeneous neighborhood, and then I moved to Long Island, where you had bigger parcels of land, and you couldn't get anywhere but by car. And but by that point, actually during high school, I went through a variety of things of what I wanted to do with my life, and I really decided I wanted to be a priest fairly early, 14, 15, 16. And I checked all sorts of religious orders, and I wanted to be a missionary. My mother wasn't keen on that. My father wasn't keen on that. They said there's a lot of work to do at home. And just as I was giving it up, at the end of my 11th grade, I met a Jesuit who I liked what he was doing, and he was working with this group called Christian Life Communities, and they were just going from sodality to Christian Life Communities. And the next thing I knew, I was going to a conference of Christian Life Communities, and I ended up being the high school board member. So I started meeting all these Jesuit schools and stuff. But before that, when I was in this high school, I started a reading clinic in a poorer neighborhood on Long Island, and I had 60 of my classmates going to this reading clinic once a week. Now, for me, doing that at the age of 15 or 16, I thought, fine, why not? And when I look back, I don't know of any 15 or 16-year-old who got 60 of their classmates to go once a week to a reading clinic. So I haven't had a lot of self-consciousness, and I think that's a good indication of it. I just did things. And it's the same with the Jesuits. I entered the Jesuits at 17. And my parents weren't too keen on that either. I remember I was going to have to go to Syracuse, and instead of them driving me there, I said I'd fly, because I never thought we'd get to Albany, let alone to Syracuse. So I got on a plane and went to there, and I entered in 1970. There were 6 people in my class, we call it. There were 19 in the class ahead of me. Some people you may know, the class ahead of me is John Baldwin and Jeff Von Arx. They of course entered a little, when they were older. I was 17. But within 2 or 3 years, most of the people left. There was this enormous exodus from religious life, especially formation. So my class of 6 became a class of 1 in 3 years. So for the past, I've been a Jesuit now for 38 years, but there's not been any classmates with me during that journey. I went to Fordham. I had to do philosophy. I did English. I picked English as my major because I couldn't write, and I didn't like to read. But I discovered literature, and I really discovered literature then and in my graduate school. I read as much as I could, with Middlemarch winning out as the best novel that I read. And then I went to be a community organizer. I was actually a community organizer during my formation with the Jesuits. Actually, right from the beginning, I was at 19. If I could get at 15, 60 classmates to do work in a reading clinic, I could get other people to do other things. And in my summers, while I was a student at Fordham, I worked in Bedford-Stuyvesant, I worked in migrant camps, I worked in the east side of Buffalo. And then I did a year of work on the east side of Buffalo, and eventually went to teaching high school at Canisius High School for 2 years. And then I went to Weston in '79. And when I was in Weston, I had been there for 2 years, and I always thought that I was going to get a parish. I always thought that I was going to be a pastor of a Jesuit parish, Central City, and I would do community organizing. That's what I wanted to do. And in 1981, I had been a Jesuit now 11 years. I was going to get ordained the next year. And the assistant to the provincial, the head of formation, that's what we call it, formation. Anyway, you know, like I was the youngest, but there were guys who were 45 having to talk to their formation person, you know, like, you've been slow. But I went to see, and I got a phone call. It was the strangest phone call of my life. I got a phone call, and I answered it, and now I can't even think of his name. Al. I pick up the phone, and he says, "Hi, Jim, it's Al." Now, I know several Al's, so I say, which Al is this? He says, "This is your provincial." I said, "Oh, hi, Al." And he says, "I'd like to see you." I say, "When?" Now, I'm in Cambridge. His office is in New York. He said, "Today." I said, "Today?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Where are you?" He said, "Here." I said, "Where's here?" He said, "Here in Cambridge. I'm right here." I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "To see you." You know, and I thought, you could have called ahead of time. He said, "Are you going to see the other people?" You know, because Baldwin and Von Ox were there, and they're in New York, and they would have had the same superior. "No, I just want to see you." So now I'll see you in 5 minutes, I said. So I went over to see him, and he said, "You're going to do a doctorate." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, you're going to do a doctorate." I said, "I'm going to do a doctorate." He said, "Yeah, you're going to do a doctorate." I said, "That's funny. I never thought of doing a doctorate." "Well, you are." So I said, "What am I going to do a doctorate in?" He said, "Political science or urban studies." Now, this was because there was a Jesuit named Dennis Woods who was teaching at Canisius College at the time. And they didn't have much of imagination, so they wanted me to be Dennis Woods Part 2. So I said, "I don't think you can afford the psychiatric bills for me working in urban studies. I'm just not inclined to urban studies." And he said, "You're going to do a doctorate." I said, "Well, I'm hearing that." And he said, "And tomorrow you're going to tell me in what?" I said, "Tomorrow?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Can I just ask you a question? 11 years a Jesuit. You know, isn't this kind of like, couldn't we have talked about this at some point?" He said, "Well, the provincial staff did." I said, "When did you have a discussion?" He said, "Yesterday." I said, "Oh, you're the first to know," he said. So I know most of you do not have a similar narrative about going to graduate school this way. Nobody ordered you to do a doctorate. So I thought I would put that into the mix as the semester starts, if in case, you know. So anyway, I go back to my community, and I said, "I'm doing a doctorate." And they said, "Oh, when did you make that decision?" I said, "I didn't make it. The superior did." I said, "What am I going to do it in?" They said, "What did they say?" I said, "Political science or urban studies." They kept laughing. I said, "What should I do it in?" And this one guy said, "You should do it in moral theology." I said, "Why?" He said, "You get A's in moral theology." I said, "Okay." I had studied with Lisa Cahill, David Hollenbach, Ed Vasic, the people who are here now were there then. And so the next day I saw him, I said, I'm going to do it in moral theology. I thought that was a good answer. And actually, I liked the field, and I was very participative in the classroom on these topics. And then he said, well, where? I said, in 24 hours, you got me doing a moral degree doctorate. I'm going to be a professor of ethics for the rest of my life. Now you're asking me, where am I going? He says, yeah, we need to know that in about a month. So then I said I wanted to go to the Gregorian. And this was a very interesting decision that I made. I had been, when I was living in Cambridge, I lived with John O'Malley, and he had a big influence on me. We were very, very good friends. But John O'Malley is a historian. And I always found that if you had progressive or moderate instincts, you should know some history. Because at least the argument that you have should be rooted in something that has already occurred. And in moral theology, at this point, this would have been 1979, people were either on the right and they were saying, this is what the tradition is, but it was a very minor interpretation of the tradition, very restricted and very conservative. On the left, nobody liked the tradition. So I wanted to know the tradition, and I thought if I went to Rome, I would learn it. And also, their father, Joseph Fuchs, was there teaching, and I had heard a lot about another priest named Klaus Stemmer. Joseph Fuchs with Bernard Haring are probably the two biggest names in the history of moral theology in the 20th century. I would eventually be Fuchs's last student. So I eventually decided on the Gregorian, and I went there, and no admissions process, it's just, are you paying? And I had 2 years of coursework, up to 7 courses a semester. It was crazy. Everything was an oral exam. You didn't do anything. You didn't hand in a paper. You didn't read anything. You just went to the lectures, and then you showed up, and you did an oral exam for 10 minutes for 20 courses. I always brought in a card that had a list of the things that I read for the course. And, the faculty would remember this because nobody else did it. And anyway, so I did that, and that's when I fell in love with moral theology. And I fell in love with the fact that we can constantly remake ourselves. My first year, everybody said that your first year after I was ordained at 29 and then went over to Rome right after my ordination. All my classes were in Italian. My brother had died 2 years before that. He was 1 year my junior. And my parents, again, were not happy with my going, especially because of my brother's death. And so I had no familial support. In fact, whenever I would call home, my mom would never get on for a year. So I was kind of isolated. I lost my brother. I was alienated from my mother. I was studying ethics, having been ordered to do this degree, in Rome. About 5 days after I arrived there, the Pope announced that we all had to wear collars. I mean, it was just like not my choice of where to be at this time. And I remember every Friday, I used to go to the Campidoglio, which is this wonderful piazza where Michelangelo designed it. And I would sit at this cornucopia, which is right near the Statue of Rome, by the Senate of Rome. I would sit there every Friday night and sob uncontrollably for an hour, and then go back to my room. It was my purgative moment. People talk about purgative. This was purgative. But I did that for a year in order to cope. I didn't understand half the things my professors were saying, mostly because of the Italian, but some of it also because the framework that they were coming from was mostly German, and that made it so German-speaking and Italian on the history of theological ethics can be a treat. But at that point, I was under Fuchs's tutelage and Klaus Stemmer's, and it was really great. Fuchs loved what I would do. My first essay that would be published was in Stimmen der Zeit. In other words, I couldn't read it. I had done a paper on To Kill or to Let Die that in a seminar that Fuchs liked so much that he sent to Germany, and the Germans translated it and published it. And then they wrote about it in Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. So I became pretty well known in graduate school pretty quickly, which was a kick for me because I am really kind of unaware of myself. I'm just like on the treadmill of life. And so at the end of all that, a number of schools wanted me to be teaching on their faculty. And I did a dissertation on Aquinas, and I ended up going to Fordham for 4 years, teaching there. And then I went to Weston for about 11 years. And then I've been here for about 4 or 5. I think in graduate studies, I remember I had 2 years of coursework and then 3 years for writing the dissertation. My mentor was, at that time, in his mid-70s. People would come up to me and say, "Joe doesn't look well." I'd go running home and write like, "I'm not." But, I learned then that you learn about the tradition. And I mean that broadly in anybody's field. If you're in philosophy, if you're in social sciences, we need to know what is the tradition about field. You learn it from persons, I remember once taking a course on Erasmus. The teacher was cuckoo, so I never learned anything. Whereas there was sometimes I took a course simply because of the professor, and I had no interest in the topic, and I learned a heck of a lot more. So I've learned that real teaching and real learning comes through mentoring. Comes through conversations, also comes through working with people of competency who are compassionate and understanding. And I had that in spades, first at Weston with John O'Malley, and then at the Gregorian with Joseph Fuchs and Klaus Nimmer. I could go on and on about Joseph Fuchs, my mentor. He was the person who, he was appointed by Pope Paul VI to the Birth Control Commission when they were doing this. And at that point, Bernard Haring was leading the progressives to change teaching on birth control. So a fellow who taught at Weston, John Ford, he was on the commission, he encouraged the Pope to put on more conservative people, including my mentor, Joe Fuchs. And this is about 64. While he's on the commission, he hears the testimonies of lay people about what birth control and what rhythm and what all these different things are. And he realizes they know more about it than the Vatican does. And he had been really one of the most respected moralists. And he was a younger man there. He would have been in his late 40s. He changed his whole theology about a moral judgment, about competency, and about the individual and conscience coming to a concrete moral judgment. He ended up becoming the author of the majority report of the commission, in which called for a change in church teaching. And then he was silenced. He couldn't teach for a year at the Gregorian. The funny thing was he was not allowed to teach he was allowed to teach graduate students, but not undergraduates. So he couldn't teach people who were going to be future priests, but he could teach people who were going to be future ethicists. But I learned hermeneutics of generosity and intelligence and competency from these guys. And then I went to Fordham. I taught there for 4 years, and I had my first 5 doctoral students. And that's what I'll finish on. I think I was trying to count the other day. I think 24 people have finished their degrees with me being their mentor, which is a good number. I have 6 now. So my mentoring people is a big thing in my life, and I think it comes from my work with Fuchs and O'Malley and Demmer. And then I have lots of undergraduates that I mentor, either in the honors program, the faith and justice, some sort of thesis. I have about 8 of the undergraduates as well. And I was just now thinking, about my life and what do I do with my life. Right now, I have cancer. I was diagnosed with I found a tumor in August. I've had major surgery in September. I had major treatment in October, and I am undergoing maintenance where I give myself 3 injections a week until Halloween. You can't imagine what I'll be dressed up on Halloween. I have quite a number of ailments that come any day, and I don't know what it's about. So I'm going through this enormous personal passage right now as to what do I want to do with my life. And it's funny. I mean, I'm happy with my life. I have this undergraduate course called HIV, AIDS, and Ethics. I easily get 60 undergraduates in it. And by the end of the semester, probably 5 more will go into med school, and another 5 will go into public health. I get letters from these students on a regular basis about how their life has changed. And the same with my doctoral students. My doctoral students know how I maintain contact with them and how they're doing, and can I help them as their career advances and stuff like that. And they're basically my life. You know, I mean, I have friends. I have lots of friends and good friends, and I have my siblings. But there's something about being a mentor to people, helping them to discover their voice, helping them to insert themselves in that tradition, but to be a new contributor to it. And I'm always enjoying that, reading it. I have Catherine Hudak from Boston University. I'm on her committee. She's doing all these things on Eastern philosophers and threw in Thomas Aquinas. When they throw in Thomas Aquinas, I'm on the committee. And, you know, I just came back from a couple of things with the doctors, and I opened up my mailbox, and there's this 180-page set of writings that I've read already twice. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, this is what you've chosen. And it's a wonderful thing. I'll just go back for a moment to my thing about changing your life. When I went to, when I was in graduate studies was when I learned the importance of an argument. I learned, I also learned that it was important to cite people. John O'Malley said that, well, he said something. He said, I always check the notes. I said, for your name, right? And, but he said, I always check the notes to see who these people are reading. That's the first thing I do. And I started doing that. One of my colleagues, a future colleague, Charlie Curran, had just lost his job at Catholic University. He said, you know, none of you can hire me, get me on a university faculty or anything like that. I eventually, this is a man who had taken a position on the birth control teaching and was removed from Catholic University, and now is down at Southern Methodist University. But, and he's a priest from Rochester. But he said, you know, none of you can do anything for me. It was a group of about 60 moralists from around the States. He said, but you can cite me. You can put me in a footnote. And I remembered that, you know, footnoting is a political act. It's the people you say you read. It's the people, but I also make sure that people I disagree with I put down, and people that are young I put down a lot. And so, like every year, I write a bibliographical essay for theological studies where I cite about 120 people. It's one of the projects that I'm involved in. In graduate studies, I realized I belonged to a community that I would learn who they were as my life would go forward. And that as a professor, I've learned to bring my graduate students into that community. So that when I go to the Society of Christian Ethics, I make sure most of my students come with me, and I make sure they meet Jean Porter or you know, Margaret Foley or somebody like that. So I'll leave it there with graduate studies and my relationship to graduate studies, and take any questions or comments. So you can see that life is, you know, as I say, I think I'm always trying to, I think the basic question I had when I wanted to be a priest was, I want to do something with my life. And since then, like here, I'm always reinventing, well, not reinventing, I'm actually starting things, whether it's the Catholic intellectual tradition or the HIB course or some other projects here. I always think that the university allows you a lot of room for creative development. Whenever I see people bored, I don't think they know they're at a university. But I do think that if you're a faculty member, you can generate so much, and there are so many opportunities that I'm just happy that I'm with people like Ken Hines and Lisa Cahill and Dave Hollenbach, Steve Pope, the ethics faculty, that we're constantly generating new ideas for the sake of the university, and that it seems to come with our natures. So.